Buenas tardes. Como bien sabrán, el voto electrónico para nosotros es algo importante, es algo que venimos continuando desde el año 2013, donde particularmente con Harry, acá presente, nos reunimos con el director nacional electoral, preguntando qué se planeaba usar el voto electrónico. En ese caso nos presentaron al presidente de MCA, a Sergio, donde nos hizo una demo contándonos qué bueno que estaba. Harry y yo nos miramos y dijimos, es un poco raro esto, corre en Linux. Y la razón de este panel y de su silla vacía, crean que es más complicado conseguir a alguien que quiera hablar a favor del voto electrónico que en contra. No sé si eso será una casualidad. Acá tenemos tres exponentes para no siempre hablar desde la Argentina, sino hablar desde el mundo. Tenemos a Enrique Chaparro, a Diego Araña y a Harry Kirsty. Yo les voy a dar el pie para que se presenten. El panel va a ser en inglés, lamentablemente no les puedo hacer traducción simultánea, pero me parece súper importante entender las problemáticas que no solo pasan en Argentina, sino que pasaron afuera, y que ellos tienen experiencia de primera mano con ello. Así que, antes que nada, les pido un fuerte aplauso para ellos. So, I think Harry was mainly the one that didn't understand anything that I said. I just said all good things and how we actually met the company that was making electronic voting, the electronic ballot in Argentina in 2013. So to start, I would like to, if you can make yourself a little bit of introduction to the public. Let's start with Diego.
So my name is Diego Araña. I'm a professor, assistant professor at the University of Campinas. My main research is in cryptographic engineering. So I try to implement cryptographic algorithms in an efficient and secure way. Almost by accident, I got involved in all of this, at least in the Brazilian case, when as a recently hired professor at the University of Brasilia, I decided to participate in these public security tests of the Brazilian voting system. And we found severe vulnerabilities both in ballot secrecy and ballot integrity. We experimentally demonstrated how the ballot secrecy vulnerability could be used to attempt fraud at a real election following official procedures. And since then, I have been working or thinking about the problem and giving talks and trying to inform the public how dangerous electronic voting can be.
Thank you. Enrique Chaparro.
Well, it's somewhat strange that we will try to understand each other in a language that is native to any of us. But that's the wonders of globalization. I am Enrique Chaparro. I've been in the field of computer security for the last probably 13 years. So before much of you were born. And I currently am, for the last decade, I've been with Fundación Vía Libre in Argentina. Fundación Vía Libre works in the field of the connections between fundamental rights and digital technologies. And electronic voting has been a matter of concern for us since 2003 or 2004, when we made our first publications on that issue. Essentially, I am a mathematician and an almost retired hacker.
Thank you. Harry?
Yes, my name is Harry Kirsty. I'm originally from Finland, currently living in the US. I have been hacking election machines 13 years. I'm a lifelong security researcher, hacker, and internet infrastructure builder. Back in 2004, I was retired. I have decided I don't want to do anything anymore, and I was asked if I would be interested to hack voting machines in Florida. I said, hell no. I'm off to Tahiti. I'm out of this game. However, I was being chased all the time, and then eventually the person who was responsible for year 2000-2004 recounts, Ian Shanshaw, who was the election supervisor of Tallahassee, Florida. Tallahassee is the Leon County, it's the capital of Florida. He asked me to take a look into his system, and that is what the hacking democracy then became. It was very interesting because it also told me that what a bunch of liars is the people who are selling this stuff to the people who are using those. So it really set the stage because I immediately found out that how many testimonies and under oath statements of the vendors were blatantly and completely wrong, even who is the manufacturer of the memory card. So eventually, this is how I got in. I never got out. My recent thing was me and Matt Blaze, Margaret McAlpine, we organized in DEF CON a voting machine hacking village. And that was a blast. Probably some of the questions will go there. But what made my heart really warm and what made me very happy was how many election supervisors came there to hack the machine they use every day. Because they have had no legal right to inspect the machine, even when they have technical knowledge sufficient to take a look. And they wanted to take the opportunity to come there and find out the truth themselves. I have to say, it was a very interesting situation when somebody comes back after 2 hours and say, this cannot be true. This can't be that bad. I say, yep, that's my 13 years. I wouldn't believe myself if I wouldn't be doing that. That's why we are doing this.
Awesome. So I think the three of you have different experiences with different voting machines, with different technologies. But I think the three of you have encountered a big wall, which is politics. In fact, we're talking about a computer that is being used to select who will be in power. So, funny enough, we think Argentina is a special country. We like to think we're special and trying to be ahead of the world, but actually, this has been done already in many parts of the world. So, Diego, how was the process of implementing electronic voting in Brazil? It was from the day to the night. There was a plebiscite. There was a voting to change the election system. How was it in Brazil?
So we used paper ballot elections during the 80s and 90s. And there were plenty of reports about how vulnerable the paper ballot elections were, mostly because they were badly designed. Just to give an example, we wouldn't have precinct level counts. All the votes were always transmitted to this huge place where all votes were counted. This opens the attack surface to all sorts of manipulation. It was a central issue with the way the paper ballot system was implemented. So the electoral authority at some point decided to move to electronic voting. So there was a process for that. I'm not completely sure if they needed congressional approval. I'm not completely sure. I believe so, but I never fully understand this part of the story. But the fact is, in 1996, they experimented with a fraction of the voting machines in some places in the country. And in 2000, they rolled this out through the whole country. So we have been voting with these machines, which still follow the state of the art in the 90s to some extent for the past 17 years in the whole country. So it's kind of strange because we are stuck in the 90s in this regard. We are still using fully electronic voting systems without no paper record, no means to verify that the machines are actually behaving as intended. So it's very disturbing when you take a close look. In terms of, I think your question also deals with institutional issues. So a big obstacle we have in Brazil is the fact that the electoral authority is responsible for everything. So they decide what technology to use. They open an acquisition process to get a company to manufacture their specification. So there's no way to compete against their specification with an improved system or superior system. They write the software nowadays. In the first editions, Diebold was responsible for both the hardware and the software. Nowadays, they write the software. They deploy the machines. They do everything. In the election day, they decide what's the correct outcome. They do everything. So they have almost full autonomy. To give an example and evidence of that, they didn't need congressional approval to roll out fingerprint identification. They just decided on someday to let's identify everyone by their fingerprints, and that's it. We buy billions in equipment, and we start rolling this out and getting everyone's fingerprints, and then the system is more secure because it is. No technical evidence supporting that. It's just the way it is.
So that sounds familiar. It looks like a flashback. Enrique, now hearing like fresh from the Brazil, do you think we're following their steps?
Not necessarily. The Brazilian project was based on an initiative of the TSE, the Supreme Electoral Court. Here mostly the steps were different, also because the specifications were not written by any electoral authority, but just came out from the market. And market is good for many things, but not particularly good for dealing with democratic issues. On the other hand, Argentina has experimented with some forms of electronic voting since the beginning of the 2000s. I think the first experiment was made in Tierra del Fuego or 2003 or something like that, using some prototypes from Indra, the Spanish company that is complicated all around the world for dealing in a non-sanctum manner with elections. Other experiments have been done, up to the point that one experiment we remember in Via Libre was done in a little town in Rio Negro, up to the point that after the election, those who called for, that was a local municipal election, after the election, the responsible for the election came to the public and asked for forgiveness because of the results. Another sympathetic test was done by 2008 or so in Pinamar. That has the surprising result of having the full results of the elections before, at the closing time of the election machines. From all those experiences, the most consistent has been that in the province of Salta since 2009, based on the machines you have seen 3 or 4 years ago.
Yeah, and Diego, in Brazil, who owns the machines? Who?
So I would say the electoral authority. They keep the machines in between elections. They write the software. They update the software through flashcards. So I would say, well, it's a public property in the sense that it was tax funded, right? But institutionally, it's the electoral authority. They are responsible for even securing the machines while they are not being used.
Perfect. And Harley, when you were doing the electronic voting village at DEFCON, how you managed to get the machines?
That was very simple.
Fácil.
It's easy. First of all, let me touch base that we had 4 different makes and models of DRE voting machines and 1 e-poll system. Only one of these systems is not going to be probably used in next election. All of the other systems had the newest version of software. They are completely current. They have been used in previous election. They will be used in next one. One of the types, which was ABS WinVote, has been decertified 2014. The one which we had actually the 2014 election data in. That doesn't mean it's not anymore used in somewhere, but at least it shouldn't be used in the US. Let me also make one interesting comment. I'm fascinated about history. And the DREs actually are a direct descendant of a lever machine. Lever machine was this humongous thing where you go to the booth, you press the buttons, you pull the lever, and it's a mechanical calculator. Lever machine was never meant to be there because we want to have faster results or more accurate results. It actually was because in the US, secret ballot came very late in the game. And so people, if there was no secret ballot, people who didn't vote as some people thought they should got feedback. And their store windows were broken, very unfortunate. Now, the result was, let's get rid of the evidence. Let's make sure that nobody can know how you voted by removing the paper. It was nothing to do with having accurate results. Actually, one of the biggest states which introduced this first, their election law still today is voter privacy is important. Voter coercion should be prevented. By the way, voter privacy is important. By the way, we shouldn't beat the voters. And then about the 10th is like, if we have good results, that's bonus. But let's not remember about the voter privacy. So, and in this environment also happened a very famous thing, it's a shoe policy. So in Pennsylvania, it is well documented, certain counties and certain townships introduced a new local law. When you go to vote, you cannot have gloves, you cannot have handshaker, you cannot have pen. When you go to booth, all of a sudden you find that all undesirable candidates, their buttons were full of black shoe polish. That's why you shouldn't have any tools. You can press those without making your hands dirty. And when you came back from the booth, you showed your fingers. And if your finger was dirty, you got feedback. So again, it's interesting that today when we are talking about DREs, electronic voting, we are thinking this as a modern thing. But we don't look into the past, why DREs became. And by the way, next year's DEFCON, we are going to have a lever machines to hack, because it's very well documented how we hack those. You put a wooden matches, because the mechanical calculator is certain rollers, and they stick there for half a day. After that, they drop off. When you remove the lever machine, a lot of matches will roll off. That means that it was rigged, but you never know how much is shaved from someone.
Awesome. So, Enrique, I think you and I and many people in the audience have tried asking for a machine in Argentina.
Yes, we did. We did many times. The only occasion we have the opportunity to be close to a machine was thanks to the gentle intervention of a political party that had one in Buenos Aires for their own for the instruction of their own people, and we had the occasion of use very advanced tools for getting into the machine. This one, the best companion of the hacker, so we could know what the machine was. We discovered after 7 years of use that the computer was not a computer but two computers, two different systems in chip doing different functions. But any information we have in Argentina comes from indirect sources. This is bad under all aspects, because it seems that some audits had been conducted in the past, but the results of audits are, let's say, amazing. I mean, a very simple bag that Alfredo, that's over there, discovered in a couple of hours, was sitting in the machine for 6 years that allowed you to cast multiple votes in only one operation. It's supposed that an audit in a 25,000 lines Python code could be discovered that way with a little bit more than a grep.
So all these questions that I have been doing, it's trying to establish a baseline, so all of you can understand a little bit of our problematic, that I'm sure there are a lot of common ground between the experience. I would love to have a fourth member in the panel trying to explain why electronic voting is good. But since we don't have it, I'm going to ask you guys, why do you think people see electronic voting as a good thing, as progress? Diego?
So the question is, why would people think it's progress?
Let's try to think of someone that is trying to push or trying to implement.
Okay. So I will just emulate the Brazilian Electoral Authority and repeat their arguments, right? I think it's more sincere and honest. So first we had fraud in the paper ballot system. So they posed this as a solution to the fraud. And most of the fraud apparently came from the tallying process, right? We have plenty of voter coercion in Brazil too. We have our own name for voter coercion. It's called Voto de Cabresto. It's so common that we actually have a name in Portuguese for it. But it seems that lots of fraud were in the tallying process. So they said, okay, now we have these computers doing the tallying. Computers make no mistakes. We can eliminate the human aspects, these words from the Brazilian Electoral Authority again. We can eliminate the human aspect of counting the votes and have software instead doing this critical task. And then since the software does not make mistakes, we have an accurate outcome. So they frequently repeat this, that they are eliminating the human intervention in the process, while ignoring, obviously, that they are actually concentrating the human intervention in just a few people responsible for writing the software. They also say that since the outcome is published much faster than before, the window of attack is much smaller, which is kind of okay, it's kind of a reasonable argument. But of course, if you think maliciously, if you have a programmer with bad intentions in the electoral authority, he doesn't care about the window of opportunity. He's manipulating the software even before the elections start. So this is a known issue. So, but these are the main, I would say, the main arguments that the Brazilian Electoral Authority says. The counting is done accurately because it involves software, and it's done fast, reducing the window of manipulation by some external attacker. Ignoring, of course, an insider which has lots of privilege for large-scale fraud if he attempts to do it.
Any of you think those reasons are something different in some other parts of the world? Enrique, do you think that's quite similar to Argentina? Ari, you have been everywhere, so I will leave it open so you can discuss it.
Generally speaking, the reasons for adoption of electronic voting around the world have been closely related to the complexity of elections. It's not the case for Argentina. Our elections are pretty simple. But when you have a single transferable vote like in Ireland, or you have to select a full list of senators like in Australia, or you have 40 or 45 races in a ballot like in the US, you probably think, well, this is too complex to handle it manually. It's not the case for Argentina and for many other countries. The other reason is the technological evolution. In fact, if you see something that is bright, electronic, and some handsome LEDs from it, well, there's in the politician's mind, it's like, I don't know, building a new bridge or a new freeway. Also, I think, we would need a sociologist for this and not a mathematician, that there's another speculation. When the voter is going to vote, the last act of government he is going to see is the voting machine. So the association of modernity with the voting machine is like doing electoral propaganda in the last 15 seconds before the people's decision. It might be, that's just some speculation. But on the other hand, there are no good reasons if you don't have serious logistical issues in elections. I mean, India may be reasonable because you have 66 official languages in India and more than 600 non-official languages and a high rate of illiteracy. So you must devise a simple system for people to vote. This doesn't prevent that Indian elections are still as fraudulent as they were in 1950, because you have a bunch of people with machetes and gloves in any school convincing you that the right way of voting is, I don't know, Partija Janata Party.
It's a commonly made argument, especially when the specter of the internet voting comes up, that electronic voting and internet voting are the mechanism to activate young people to vote. Interestingly enough, both Estonia, where they still use it, and Norway, where they stopped using it, published the breakdown of the age brackets. And you see the young people are declining as the participation in internet voting. They rather vote on paper. There's multiple reasons why also the older people, or people over 55, is the fastest growing group in electronic voting and internet voting. So the argument is patently false in that sense. The other part is completely clever wordsmithing and mispresentation. There is a manufacturer called Danaher. They say our voting machine is not a computer, it's a giant calculator. When you open it, just happens to happen, it has a system on chip inside. Well, then again, the first calculators were done with Intel 4004, so I guess that's part of the truth. The same thing is, interesting enough, when we had a conversation about transfer of vote, in US, politicians generally believe that they have banned using of network technology in transferring votes. So what was happening in November 2016 election, it was discovered that certain paper scanners, they have these wireless modems. Well, certainly these wireless modems have nothing to do with network, except it goes to the mobile phone operator, and it failed in a test, and the explanation, it had the wrong IP address, and they had a typo in a firewall script. That doesn't sound network at all to me. So anyway, a lot of times when politicians are misled in understanding the technology by clever wordsmithing, explaining the technology in a way which seems to them familiar. And that also drives the process of saying, we want to be modern, but we don't want to take risk, and this sounds risk-free.
So I want to open up the mic a little bit. Since this panel, we have a good time slot. Any one of you would like to ask a question? Ivan?
Rita.
Rita.
Great. So, in general, most of the systems that you have seen, all of them, are, for what you described, are not very elaborate, right? And in Argentina, there's a single academic person that I have record of that actually endorses electronic voting, the dean of a informatics faculty, that said that, okay, yes, all those systems are broken, they have problems, but if we do it right, then there wouldn't be any problem. So my question is, it has two parts. First, is it possible to do an electronic voting system right? And if it is possible, what is to do it right?
Okay. The tricky questions we just try to throw to other people because it's really hard to answer. So yeah, that's a tricky question because many of these systems, they work beautifully as an idea, right? As on paper, we have these beautiful cryptographic voting systems in the research literature that are amazing, have amazing properties. But they, for example, if you want to explain them to a layman, the person won't understand a single thing. So there is a strong barrier to even understand the functional components of this. So many of these systems work as an idea, and things start to break down when you build actual systems to implement this. So I don't know if security voting, by a strong definition of security, is possible. I believe perhaps this is not the question we should try to answer. Perhaps the question is, are reasonably secure systems possible to construct? in which the cost of attack is prohibitive, and this can be deployed in large scale in a certain country with certain characteristics. And what system does it look like? Things that I can pinpoint are, there must be a paper record in case you need a fallback mechanism for counting votes, and for audits or recounts or anything you actually need, so there must be a paper record for independent verification. And the system should be as simple as possible, right? This is simply good engineering. It should rely very little on software. Software should be easy to analyze. You should have clear protocols to deploy software, to update software. That's about what I can say, but it's really hard to answer the question without having like a concrete system to analyze. Just this ideal asymptotic thing that we can actually construct and preserve its security properties.
Yeah, I will second that. We have a number of promising ways of thinking about electronic voting in the future. For example, homomorphic encryption. I'm happy to be friend with one of the developers of that technology. He thinks it might solve the problem. He's in his 40s. He doesn't think it happens in his lifetime. The other problem is that most Western countries have a statute which says that the election process has to be understandable for common man without special skills or tools. So until we live in a Star Trek universe where teenagers casually talk about quantum mechanics, we are probably not going to have the 70-year-old woman figuring out the homomorphic encryption algorithm and figuring out how it works. Now, then the other part is that we have a humongous amount of different kind of democratic processes. Finland, it's just one number put to a square. It's very easy to calculate by hand, and results are done in 3 hours. And as mentioned before, in the US there is a new thing starting, for example, in San Francisco, rank-based voting. So you give a vote to one candidate. If that candidate doesn't get elected, your vote jumps to another candidate. These systems are extremely complex, and we all know humans, we are very error-prone. Also sometimes malicious, but error-prone. And the problem there is that we have to use technology, and there has to be a responsible way of deploying that technology. Personally, I believe it has to be paper ballot. There's no alternative to that, because that records the voter's intent. And that also, I don't believe in VVPRs. I don't believe, so voter verified paper trail, because we have shown in a number of hack attacks. First of all, we can cancel and print a new receipt because there has to be a procedure for canceling if the voter changes in the last moment their mind. But also, people just generally don't verify it when there's 17 or 28 races on the same ballot. They just lose interest at a certain point of time. So there's got to be a way where you can use a device which marks the ballot for you, but it's a real ballot, which carries the voter's intent in permanent media called paper. Yes, we have a lot of fraud in paper. We have got very good in detecting fraud. That's why the banks are not all bust. They go bust for other reasons, but not because of this. And then you used to have to have a technology which helps people to tally the votes, and you have to have a strong auditing. Auditing is everything. Don't audit the machines, audit the results, because the results are the ones which matter. So have a procedure where it's a low barrier to do mandatory audit. And even if you think you know the answer, actually when it's 80-20 winner in the audit using a multiple of risk limiting methods is extremely easy and low cost to do. So there's no reason not to do. So all about going there and verify the result. Always trust but verify.
Yes, I think we all agree on the fact that it's very difficult to explain homomorphic encryption to minority. Up to that point, a central issue comes. It's elections should be understood by everyone and should be reproducible, auditable by everyone, because this is the essence of a democratic process. If we do elections, I don't know, and IACR, the International Association of Cryptology Research, We use homomorphic encryption, in fact, because it's a pretty useful tool for the 400 people voting through the internet.
And we have PhDs in cryptography, right?
Yes. So it's like, I don't know, pulling straws. But anyways, this is a main issue. The other issue here is it possible to build a reasonable voting machine? I don't mean a secure voting machine. Secure and machine are oxymorons. So I think it is. But the first question in that case should be why? We can build a reasonably secure machine after years of research, after doing spatial hardware, after solving some paradoxes, after a reasonable way, at a humongous cost, for something that is perfectly done on paper. And we could probably concentrate our efforts in improving the way for telling the results and transmitting the information. That's where most of the problems appear. Because nothing can be better than the direct contact of the voter and the expression of his or her will. That is, paper, or as in the Gambia, little crystal balls. In the Gambia, you do not use paper. You use balls. So when you go to voting, the electoral authority gives you a glass ball. You get into a secluded place where there are oil barrels painted with the colors of the different parties, and you put your ball in the adequate barrel. The barrel has also a drop with a little bell. So the bell sounds when you drop the ball, and the electoral authority outside knows you have voted, and you have voted once. Direct relationship between the voter and the expression of his or her will. Easy to count, easy to understand.
From my experience, I think, at least in Argentina, voting secrecy and universal vote, the meaning of understanding how you make your vote, at least with electronic ballot or electronic voting, is not considered as something important, but more important is traditional fraud, where everyone can identify that fraud. And in fact, at least in Argentina, first, elections are mandatory for every citizen, and you have different types of law enforcement on premises. So right now, you can actually see the fraud, and you can be like, hey, they're making fraud. So they're planning to put a machine. They don't know how fraud can be done. So my point is, why do you think a country like Argentina might lose its secrecy and universality of the, and I lost my English. The universal aspect of voting just by implementing something to look modern. Harry, you have been in different parts of the world, in third world countries, first world countries as well.
Gracias.
Do you think it's something that you already saw, this movie?
It's actually very interesting, the Ghana example. One of the things which is very delightful is in the traditional way in Switzerland, where when the polls close, the doors are opened, and people come with wine and cheese as the whole village to see the ballots being counted. And Switzerland happens to be one of the places where they have tried internet voting, and all of a sudden all of this is gone. The whole aspect of the village coming together, the whole aspect of everybody being there debating about the topics while they are waiting to see who won, especially because the cantons have a humongous amount of autonomy. It really, in the places where they have tried, and when I speak with the locals, they say, well, this whole thing, when it's gone, they didn't even realize what they lost. And that's a way of, especially, it's not only that you lose the feeling how my way of influencing the community works, but it also takes the community away from the whole process. So we really should think hard and understand why elections are conducted in a certain way, what is the all social aspects of the election. And again, as I said, it's when I speak with people from Switzerland, they definitely say that technology took a lot away from their identity, from their village, from their commune.
So I think about this a lot because the research community sometimes discusses that if we lose ballot secrecy, the problem becomes so much easier to solve, and perhaps we have ideal solutions as previously mentioned. So perhaps we should, since our democracies are maturing, perhaps we should trade this off, like have convenient forms, easier forms of voting, and just lose voter privacy. But the thing is, I try to think, I come from a country where voter coercion is still very common. So even though we move it to electronic voting, which prevents anyone from verifying their votes, right? Even the own voter, in the case of the DRE system used in Brazil, there are still places in the country where local militia will try to convince the voters that they can actually find out how they voted, either individually or by just saying, if our candidate doesn't win, you will suffer the consequences. So it's fairly easy to still do voter coercion under this setting. So I try to think it like this. Of course, in countries where voter coercion is a tradition, we need voter privacy for sure. In countries where this perhaps is not as important because their democracies are more mature, I still think that having voter privacy is important to prevent reaching the situation where you desperately need it back.
Yes, in fact, voting secrecy is not a feature, it's a protection. So in parliaments, you don't have secret voting because you need to know how your representative has voted. Voter secrecy is the essential protection against coercion. And curiously, electronic voting makes that type of coercion easier. Because probably 99.5% of the people approaching a voting machine doesn't know how it works. So I can convince you as President Maduro in Venezuela that I have the ID card numbers of everybody that voted against me. Probably in the Star Trek times that Harry has just told us about, everybody will be able to understand what's happening, and that type of coercion will be more difficult. But in this time, and probably for the next couple of generations, this type of coercion is still possible. So this is a fundamental protection. Of course, if we release any of three, integrity or verifiability or secrecy, we can have perfect voting systems. But unfortunately, voting systems are difficult things because their specifications are different from any other system we have imagined.
Actually, one point out, this is very interesting. This is a voting machine we studied, I think 2007 with Princeton University. Just trying to remember which one we studied, but I'll tell what is the machine. The machine is a humongous screen of a lot of buttons. It's not touch screen, it's actually physical switches. It's that kind of DRE, direct recording voting machine. And when you vote, and then you press cast ballot, it says thank you for voting. Now, a poor little voter might think that that means something. However, in that particular system, the poll worker, which is standing behind the machine so that the poll worker cannot see how the voter is voting, has a button. And if you hear that the voter is coming to the end of voting, you can press that button. And now when the voter casts the ballot doesn't go anymore. And you can go and cast your own vote. And actually the investigation was started by the fact that in a primary where that state has a closed primary, so Republicans can only vote for Republicans, Democrats can only vote for Republicans, there was a mismatch of how many Republicans and Democrats came. So there was a wrong party's ballots cast. I was also delighted when Diego explained the very primitive matrix, how the voter privacy is supposed to be preserved, because that machine actually had pretty much exactly the same. It's a made on our side of the world, but they in that place had made it very much easier because you have the poll booth, so you sign in to vote, and you're given a token, and then you give that token to poll worker puts the ring, and that token is numbered. And the poll book is public document, and that ring is public document, and the memory card is public document, and since you can de-scramble it, now you have a 100% proof how everybody voted. What could possibly go wrong?
Ahí me levantan la mano en el fondo. No llega el micrófono, así que van a tener que proyectar toda su voz como en clase de teatro.
Okay, so my question is, when proposers of technological voting, let's say, talk about these new systems, they mention time being a thing. Like it's easy, it's faster election itself, or the results come faster, something like that. Do you think time is, and do you think it should be taken into account? And if so, why?
So, yes, lots of countries turn to electronic voting thinking that having a faster result helps somehow. Of course, it helps the government to provide evidence that it's doing something right. Because in Brazil, this is something common. Like the electoral authority announced speed records. So in this election, we tallied the whole country in 5 minutes less. And we are so competent at doing this that we could make it faster and faster and faster. At the same time, if you think about it, if you want it to be really efficient, we don't even have to vote. Like just flip a coin or a series of coins and select the candidate. It's fairly fast. And you can have this unbiased coin, so it's even verifiable, right? So, of course, efficiency is not the main metric. Depending on the system, it might play some effect on security. For example, for a paper ballot, a traditional paper ballot election, I would like this system to be organized in such a decentralized way that you actually count or tally the precincts in parallel and can reach a result faster, because then you can publish it and not have a long time until the result becomes public, where, I don't know, people may speculate and some instability may arise, especially if democracy is really not that stable in the country. So efficiency plays some effect, I think, but it shouldn't be, of course, the first or the main criteria to select the voting system, no matter what type you assume. Like if it's a paper ballot or electronic voting system. It's one of the variables, but it's not the most important one. Of course, verifiability and transparency are much more important, even considering the hypothetical example I gave about flipping coins.
Time is important if you measure it in weeks, not if you are measuring it in hours. And even if you measure it in weeks, if you have an electoral system that is trusted by the majority, even a month doesn't matter. It's all it takes to get the results of Australian elections. Because Australian elections are very complex because of the country and because of the election system. So you have to count every vote about 16 times in order to figure out who is the senator for Queensland. I think the main interest on urgency to present the results are prime time newsreels and television networks. We want to continue with our stupid show after the election, and if we have not results, we will be doing this stupid thing up to midnight or 4 a.m. In fact, we have had the results of the last German election in the early morning at 99.75% when it was counted by hand. So that makes no difference. Going to a local example, stats show that the maximum time we have for counting the results at an election site is about 2 hours and a half. All the delay is caused by the methods of transmitting the information and not by the counting itself. So we can improve the way we transmit the information. On the other hand, this concern about time, also this concern about the delegation of electoral processes is related to something that what Harris said a couple of minutes ago brought to my memory. There's, I think, something like saying all citizens, politics is a thing of other people. Forget about involvement in politics. And politics is our everyday. Even if we don't want it. This expropriation of our fundamental right to vote is part of more general expropriation of the sense that we participate in politics. Switzerland style. And in every little town in Switzerland, and every the little cantons that make direct voting in the square, voting is a party, literally. It's a party with sausages and wine and cheese. We need to recover that sense of party. I'm old. Most of my young life happened under military dictatorships. So for me at least, voting is a party.
I have been over a decade used a title of a lot of my presentations, which actually comes to that note. Governments can be changed by bullets or ballots. That's how serious it is. And yeah, do you want to have a quick bullet or a quick ballot? I mean, just the whole question is, if somebody's pointing your gun and saying, why are you taking so long to decide whether you shoot me? Shoot already. No, we don't want to do that. We want to take the time and consider what are the real things. And so if I would put my point there is to say, there are certain constraints. People are, the election day is long, then the counting starts. You have certain things which it makes a very long day for everybody who's involved in elections, but still make it right. You anyway need to do a recount. You anyway need to do an audit. Actually, a lot of people didn't realize how long it takes some states to be called in the last presidential election. It took them way long to call their election, even when they use electronic voting. So take your time and make sure that you have the right candidate to win the right winners. I think that's more important than the speed. And again, I would actually contradict. There is two things in the news media. News media likes that tension and the predictable sales of advertising on the election night. If it cannot be done, always, as the consultants say, a good money can be made by prolonging the problem. Nothing sells more advertising than weak-link drama when people are trying to figure out who won.
Questions? Okay. Too many hands. Beu, vamos. Tenemos tiempo, así que. Beu. Beatriz.
Just in your opinion, while electronic voting, well, we hear news from countries in Europe leaving electronic voting, seems to be a trend in Latin America. In your opinion, why is this happening in our region?
Another tricky question. So, of course, I can say things about all countries, but I see some common trends. We are used to big government, and big government wants to provide everything, including voting. So perhaps this plays a part. Also, big government prevents people from auditing its behavior, usually, right? So it becomes, if you take a look at Brazil and probably Venezuela and certainly Argentina, if the local community is not fast enough to revert this decision, these systems have been blinded juridically, legally, and technically from inspection. So they actually spend decades advertising the good properties of the system that people can verify, like speed, and not actually discussing what's really important about the system, which is verifiability and transparency, or auditability, call it the way you want. So they managed to convince a large fraction of the population that this is actually a good way to vote, and people will actually resist changing the system to anything else because they were essentially brainwashed by a decade-long advertisement campaign. So perhaps it's a consequence of big government, and which also brings together like strong propaganda, and then we tend to trust. It's really impressive to me that in Latin America we have big government. We actually distrust big government for everything, but somehow, magically, people trust big government when they change or propose a voting system. So I can't fully answer the question. That's my speculation. I also don't understand why. Not trusting everywhere else, but trusting in the term or in the context of electronic voting. This is very strange to understand.
I would point a little bit because there is in all industrial countries an interconnection how things work. Why in US the electronic voting had a race is very simple. We all remember in year 2000 when punch cards were trying to be determined whether they are shanging heads or pregnant chads or whatnot, because the actual punch hole was not clearly separated. In DEFCON, we actually have that year 2000 catastrophic machine as part of the demonstration by Matt Place. And what happened there is that when a certain candidate is very popular and people keep pushing those shads, the small space underneath fills up. And it's increasingly more difficult to cast a vote to a popular candidate. That is the reason. There's another reason, which was a number of jurisdictions who tried to save money by changing the kind of paper and perforation they use. But that scandal, which was the year 2000 recount, as a response, Americans did what Americans always do best, which is, oh, we have a problem, let's throw a lot of money to the problem will go away. That was a Help America Vote Act of 2002. It created, top of my head, $3.1 billion of funding, federal funding for jurisdictions to go and modernize their voting technology, which obviously was a gold rush. So everybody who had anything they can sell as a voting machine started selling them, and literally some of the machines originally were designed to be a kennel machines, gambling machines, whatnot. They were not designed to be a voting machines. That created the electronic voting boom. Now, moving back to the paper, as mentioned, 2005, I hacked the default paper scanning machine, 2006, the touchscreen machine. It created a situation where Secretary of State California, Secretary of State of Ohio, number of other voting officials started ordering independent studies of the machines and found out these are vulnerable. And that created a move where a lot of states moved back from electronic voting to paper ballot, basically realizing the electronic voting is so unsecure and unsafe, it cannot go on. Then 2008 happened. And some might remember there was some financial trouble at the time. That kind of slowed the process of moving back to paper. And now with the recent effects where people finally have realized there are nations which might be interested to influence elections, now we are back in a game where people are looking how to secure. So what I'm seeing right now, this is the second wave of moving away from electronic voting, and it's because of the realization that cyber war is real. Also, I would like to point out that in a number of democracies, there's a lot of actual issues down in the ballot. Would be have a $2 billion for that railroad or $5 billion for that dam. That's where the money is. And the manipulation of these machines is sufficiently easy for an entrepreneur, say criminal entrepreneur, to look into the ways of having the lower in the ballot, and this is an international problem, and everywhere we have it. So I think one of the biggest problem is that by speaking about nation-state actors, it is a false sense of security because it creates a little bit of mindset in a public mind that you need to have such a resources. As we demonstrated in DEF CON, it took people who had never seen a voting machine in their life, had no way of bringing the right tools, and yet after 2 hours we had fallen machines, and after 3 days everything had fallen. That is the reality, how easy it is. And that's what people did for fun. Think about it, somebody would pay them to do it.
Por acá
Yes,
teníamos...
I think that the conclusion is pretty obvious. Electronic voting machine manufacturers need markets. They got to survive, so they will come to Latin America or go to Africa or Southeast Asia or wherever. This is a matter of survival in many things. Besides the technological evolution we have been speaking about.
A ver, atrás de Iván.
Yes. Well, you mentioned in Brazil there is this, you are obliged to vote. You know some case in which some people deny to vote because he doesn't understand the system, or?
No, but actually it's mandatory, but if you decide not to vote, you pay just a small fine, so it's not a big deal. So you pay like $3 and that's it. So, but it's still 80% of people show up to vote. I don't know exactly why, since it's so cheap to pay the fine, but I haven't seen a public case of someone protesting or doing any kind of manifestation, demonstration on the election day to push people to not vote because the system is insecure or anything along these lines. Perhaps it's something interesting to try. Perhaps when I go back home, I spread this idea around to have a protest, centralized protest, so it's not shut down easily. So, but no such cases in Brazil. No one thinks too much about this stuff because you just pay this small fine, or you go there and nullify your vote anyways because the available choices are horrible.
Let me bring some anecdotal evidence that seems interesting because of what Diego said about Brazil. Belgian law, Belgium has also compulsory voting. But it's not, in fact, compulsory voting. What is compulsory is going to vote. So if you want to protest against the electronic system that is used in about 40% of Belgian municipalities, you go to the voting place, you say, I came here to vote, but I am not going to vote. Please seal my voting documents as I have complied with the law, but I'm not going to vote with the check.
So it's a related comment. Not only voting is mandatory, but also enrolling into the fingerprint identification program is also mandatory. So you have to provide your fingerprints at some point in time, otherwise your voter registration gets screwed up. And then you have all sorts of problems with your salary. You have all sorts of problems, right? So you cannot get a public servant position anymore. If you are a public servant, you won't receive your salary. So healthcare, you get all sorts of problems if your registration is problematic. So I know some colleagues from University of Brasilia that try to formally not provide their fingerprints, but of course the electoral authorities, the judicial branch, they legally decided to forbid these people from protesting in this way. So you end up losing, it's a lose-or-lose situation.
Iván, tenías ahí una pregunta.
Yes. Last year, the Argentinian government tried to pass a law that allowed for electronic voting nationwide. They failed, but that law included an article, a clause, that criminalizes security research of voting machines, criminalizes it with jail time. So, my question is, I suspect this is not unique to Argentina. It has happened in other countries. I know that in the US, the fact that the hacking village was possible is because there was an exception to the DMCA recently, in 2015. But my question is, how common is to see this kind of legal requirement or to criminalize research on voting machines? And what is your advice, since you have been doing research on voting machines? What is your advice to overcome this kind of thing?
So this is a experience from a lot of places. First of all, when I started hacking in the US voting machines 2005, there were a number of states which immediately started looking how to criminalize any security research. And there were states which say, oh my God, this is a good idea. Let's make sure that this goes on. So you all of a sudden, Utah made, after I did my touchscreen, the first DRA hack in Utah, they actually changed a law which have made my action in future criminal. While the Secretary of State Bowen in California went completely other way and looked at, well, let's make sure that the research happens. But that leads to another place. So in the US, it was common that the law dictated that the voting machine vendors have to submit the source code and the built environment to escrow. So now when the study started, those escrows were first time ever pulled. And guess what? In very many occasions, the source code was not there. It was just empty disks. When we did, and this is documented when we did Everest study, which was conducted, or which was commissioned by Secretary of State Ohio, Jennifer Brunner, we asked built environment from every vendor whose system is sold in Ohio, used in Ohio. Only one vendor ever submitted. All the other vendors told they have not preserved the built environment, which made it impossible for us to verify that whatever source code they give is anything to do with the code running. It's also a good point which you made. The DMCA has been the big hammer, saying if you are inspecting proprietary code, and by the way, number of vendors have claimed that the paper ballot is proprietary. You cannot inspect those because they own the paper layout. They have been claims that they own the memory card content, so the digital record. Again, there's a lot of state law issues, but the interesting thing here is really to make the claim, say it's the people who vote, and people are the ones who own the vote, and people are the ones who own the evidence. And the government owes that. And again, when we look, a lot of governments who have been, smaller governments who have been, it's the vendors who are marketing and the vendors who are leading the customer to implement protections for their trade secrets. And literally, trade secrets. Voting machine and voting, how your vote is counted. They call it trade secret. And this is the mechanism trying to prevent anybody to investigate how your votes are going to be cast. I think it's unbelievable that people are accepting that kind of argument. You know, what kind of public process, which is supposed to be the cornerstone of democracy, what kind of public process can be trade secret and copyright? Never think about one more thing, which is that if I would be a real criminal and I would be, rigging the election, would I really care about the Digital Millennium Copyright Act that much? That would be the least of my worries. And last, which I want to point out, the fingerprint. There was recently in a public hearing in the US where one of the proposals was to use a same check as the gun license to find your eligibility to vote. And one Secretary of State made a good point that even using driving license is unintended, because driving license previously didn't have a picture. And the pictures were added to driving license not for voting purposes, but for the purposes of people not using each other's IDs to buy beer. Again, now when voter registration, they're using the barcode on the license plate, driving license, not an unintended consequence. Now the barcode be used as an injection mechanism, SQL inject, cell inject, whatever. Again, whenever you are starting to introduce something like the fingerprint, my first question would be, as a citizen, what are the most likely unintended consequences of this action? In Estonia, they have the Estonian claim for internet voting was that they have an encryption key on a card, which, by the way, they just admitted they have 750,000 vulnerable cards, which we did disclose in our report 2014. But their whole idea was, you let people, they try to find a person with argument, you can vote as many times as you want, and the last vote counts, which obviously begged us to ask the question, can we force the signatures cryptographically? And the answer was yes. So again, always think about the unintended consequences.
One thing I think is worth noticing is you don't actually have to criminalize the research. You can also try criminalizing the behaviors that could allow you to do research. So in the case of Brazil, performing research is not a crime of any ways, but there are no legitimate ways of getting access to the machines. You have to break the law to get access. So of course, if you try to do this, you're going to be punished as an example. So, and it's even trickier there because the electoral authority is part of the Supreme Court. The president of the electoral authority is a Supreme Court judge. So if you break the law in that the federal crimes involving these behaviors, you get prosecuted at the Supreme Court. I'm completely convinced of that. It escalates really quickly. You're going to be made an example. So the only things we could do were just participating in the small opportunities where we could check, inspect the source code, and try to figure out how insecure these systems were. We had to play the game along with the electoral authority because any other behavior was criminal, although legitimate for research reasons. So we were lucky to find out that the systems were such insecure that even under all those restrictions, we could still obtain evidence and provide technical assessments of how insecure they were, but we were lucky. Perhaps it's not that simple, or restrictions can prevent you from doing that, and then the electoral authority will just claim that they won this hacking challenge because no one could break the system. So it's really tricky. It depends a lot on how the organization happens in a certain country. What I find useful is to participate in these exercises and try afterwards to be brutally honest, to be technically accurate, and to inform the public as much as possible. It's the only weapon we have to fight in some cases.
So we have a few minutes. We have less than 20 minutes. So I would like if we can journal a little bit the answers so we can make a faster interaction between the public. I think most of them have a lot of questions.
I will just make a quick comment to that. One thing which, before we start hacking election machines, was the mantra. The mantra was to say, well, maybe because of Berkeley, use the source look, don't batch those binaries, use the source look. Actually, people were believing that source code review would be a meaningful way of inspecting the election machines, and one of the things would be demonstrate immediately is it's not. Because you have so much firmware, you have so much hardware, you have so much hardware design issues, you cannot trust the source.
Hi, how are you? If someone can change the result of the votation, how can you prove this?
Another difficult question. First, let me make a caveat. No system, manual, electronic, or even by transmission of thought, can be tricked to change a 60-40 election to a 40-60 election. Because there is a social perception on the results of the election. If you want to change an election you lost for 20 points to one you won, you'll need the absolute use of force. Problems arise when the difference are very little, when you have a couple of points. And the tricky part of electronic voting systems is you can do micro-fraud all along the country. I mean, if 3.5 votes were switched along our country, the president would be now a different person. You cannot do that manually. You need a real army. You need 250,000 people waking up at 4 a.m. in the morning Sunday. And if you have those 250,000 loyal people for doing fraud in every voting place in the country, you can probably win the election legitimately, or arm them and take the power using the bullets instead of ballots. So it's very difficult to make ex post audits when the difference are very little. Risk limiting audits are a fantastic statistical tool. Up to the point you have very, very little differences. I mean, risk limiting audits work very well for first past the post systems, like in the US or in Britain, but don't work so well for proportional systems. Because when you're going to allocate the last seat in the parliament, the difference are probably a fraction of 1,000. So it is very, very difficult to do that. You can say, okay, if we have some like a voter verified ballot, a piece of paper, the problem there is a matter of bias in terms of interpretation. You have seen the face of a guy in the screen in colors, and you have something printed in a font 4 in a piece of paper. You can probably recognize an association or not. What we know from conducted psychology is that you will probably be wrong 2/3 of the time. There are some interesting experiments of this. So, to wrap your question, how can we audit exposed? Probably we can't.
Yeah, the risk limiting audits and audits of all kinds, always look the evidence, always look the paper, and if you don't have a paper, if you don't have that, you are dead in the water. Also, earlier question, which was when you meet the politicians, this is something which is shocking until you are in election world. This is a major, major jurisdiction. And the election supervisor in that place, very good person, but relying on the infrastructure provided by this major county and state. And when we had an event about hacking the machine, the IT chief of the jurisdiction comes red-faced yelling, Harry, what you are doing? Of course these machines can be hacked, but we are not counting real things like money. And he said that, and then the room went quite quiet. But that is also one thing which is real. People don't have always the same perception of importance of voting.
¿Alguna pregunta? ¿Alguien quiera preguntar en español si la traducimos? Como nos quedan solo unos minutos, les quiero... Sorry, and I switched to Spanish. So, that could be a problem. So, we have around 12 minutes left, and I would like to give you some free time for each, so you can do some wrapping up of the panel if you want to leave a message to the people that right now our future viewers of this video.
So I'll be brief and just repeat the lessons I've learned from the past 5 years working in this space. Is if you can try fixing your paper ballot election before moving to electronic voting, this is the right way forward. If you move to electronic voting and spend a decade doing it as is the most secure thing on the planet, it's really hard to go back, or even to reintroduce some kind of record, physical record that allows for verification, because you have this massive amount of propaganda to counter-argue, and it's much harder to defeat a wrong idea than to oppose it, right? It's just the effort is at least 10 times higher to argue against bullshit, essentially. So fix the paper ballot system before you move almost permanently to electronic voting. And well, if you are already under the assumption that electronic voting, or this applies to any voting system, of course, but perhaps this is harder with electronic voting, you need to have proper auditing and transparency mechanisms in place and proper protocols to deal with those. It's not just having paper records. You need very clear protocols to deal with any mismatch and to sort out what's the right move to take in case these things happen in practice. Because elections are complex, and in countries like Brazil, they are large enough that this will happen at least once somewhere. So you need a clear specification of what to do, and not leave to the courts with their own conflicts of interest to decide.
Two conclusions, and even diametrically opposed. First is voting as a theoretical task for us in the computer world is a fantastic field. There's a lot of questions still open. We know that others are closer in the worst way. We know already that we cannot have something that is at the same time verifiable, integer, and private. Okay, how will we deal with that contradiction? What's the portion of privacy or integrity or verifiability we can lose in order to have a balanced system? Are voting systems classical Byzantine problems, or are different kind of Byzantine problem that requires different types of collusion from the adversary? Are security functions in voting systems composable or non-composable? If you are working on a thesis, probably it's a good way to work. Now, in practice, despite all the exercises we can do in theoretical computer science, in practice, the most important thing for a democracy is, a democracy is not only voting, but the most important thing in a democracy is voting. So please don't fuck with it. There's a lot of room to improve things in the way we conduct and control the elections. Just let's try to not do it in the most critical point. We can improve the ways we tally the results, we can improve the way we transmit the results, we can improve usability of paper ballots, we can improve usability of paper documents we use. Please don't touch this sacred moment when every citizen is as powerful as anyone in the world to take a decision.
friends don't let friends to vote in internet. we have a sometimes repeated misconception, which is say, I can throw my vote away. If I want to vote in electronic, if I want to vote in internet, who is you to say that I cannot do it? The problem is, it's the system as whole. If somebody wants to use a compromisable system, it doesn't disfranchise that person, it disfranchises everybody else. Because the voting elections are getting tighter and tighter, we are getting more polarized views, the margin of victory is smaller. You cannot let people to compromise the integrity of system by just being people who don't care enough about the system as a whole. Use paper ballots, audit. Make sure that you are absolutely choosing the right people. Don't use technology which is compromisable. Use technology in a responsible way. I believe in paper ballots. I believe in a lot of democracies, paper ballots has to be processed with the computers, having a manual process. Look open source software. There is a software called OpenCount, for example. It can do your analyze from commercial off-the-shelf scanners. Use those to scan the images. Use OpenCount to count. Removes the voter lock. Vendor lock. That's another thing which we have been talking about. How many election vendors are squeezing a lot of money out of this business? There is a number of open source solutions out there which can be used. Obviously, they are not profitable to anyone, and there's no kickback money for that. But that's part of having an open government and open democracy. So that's my take. Be very responsible how you use technology, and use technology for good.
Bueno, creo que fue más que interesante, así que les pido un fuerte aplauso a la primera Enrique. I think it has been a great panel. It has been an honor to have you all three today at Ekoparty. I know that maybe we have a similar opinion with minor differences, but I think it was important to tell a little bit of your experience to other people and maybe to inspire them to help everyone else. Thank you.